you know that the wine district of the Swartland in South Africa is over 120 kilometers long, which is huge, but it has been subdivided into 7 sub-zones, or wine wards as we call them here in South Africa. These wine wards are Malmesbury, Riebeeksrivier, Riebeeksberg, Porseleinberg, Paardeberg or Paardeberg or Paardeberg, means horse mountain. Then there's Paardeberg South, and finally Piket-Bo-Berg. To give you a little bit of context on some of these wine wards, Porseleinberg is the ward that gave South Africa its very first 100 points. Syrah Tim Atkin gave the 100 points. Cully Lowe made the wine under the label of Porseleinberg. The Paardeberg, for its part, is home to some really rather world-famous wine producers like Eben Sadi, Arie Badenhorst, David and Nadia, and Leeuwenkale. It's arguably the most celebrated subzone of the lot. But Malmesbury is no slouch either, because this is a ward that produces fruit for producers like the Mullinoes, and also for the lesser known but very highly respected Nativo label. But the ward that makes me the most excited is Piket-Bo-Berg, because of all the crazy things that are going on there right now. But we'll talk more about that just now, because we need to get to our wine of the day, which is the Mother Rock for Celeste Chenin Blanc 2022, made by winemaker Johan Meyer, who just happens to own Platteklip Vineyards in Piket-Bo-Berg. The Piket-Bo-Berg Plateau sits on the northern end of the Swartland at about 800 meters above sea level. Now this puts it just above places like the Piekenierskloof, also in the Swartland, and situates it just below places like the Cederberg or the Ceres Plateau, both of which sit at over 1,000 meters above sea level. Now, while Piket-Bo-Berg is technically part of the fairly hot and dry Swartland, it really is a completely different world. First of all, it's worth noting that as the crow flies, Piket-Bo-Berg is as far from Malmesbury, which is kind of Swartland Central, as Malmesbury is from Elgin. And if Master of Wine Richard Kershaw is to be believed, Elgin is the coolest wine region in all of South Africa. It accumulates seemingly more cold units than either Walker Bay or Agulhas. And if we're to continue the comparison between Piket-Bo-Berg and Elgin, Piket-Bo-Berg is up to 400 meters higher on average than Elgin. And even though the daytime temperatures are roughly the same as Elgin, the nighttime temperatures are way, way colder, and there's almost no humidity. A fascinating place to make wine. Now, when we take all of those factors and add them to some vineyard slopes that face south, and you realize that Piket-Bo-Berg can be really rather chilly, which is why winemaker Johan Meyer has planted cultivars like Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, and Pinot Noir. All of this means that, in reality, we could very soon have access to a 100% Pinot Noir that is also 100% wine of origin Swartland, which just sounds absolutely bonkers. But then if you've tasted any of Johan Meyer's Mother Rock wines, you'll realize that bonkers is really dead central to his comfort zone. Now, I have to curb my enthusiasm about Piket-Bo-Berg because today's Hand Drink Solo Wine of the Day is not from Piket-Bo-Berg.
Are you serious?
Are you insane?
Why didn't you just tell me that?
We'll never get that time back.
Well, you might not appreciate this now, but I'm pretty sure that you will appreciate it in the future. Instead, today's wine of the day is from the Paardeberg, or the Paardeberg, as I said earlier, arguably the Swartland's most critically acclaimed wine ward. What I mean by that is it has the longest list of famous winemakers who all get critical acclaim. Now, the fruit for this wine comes from the Cederberg, which is up at around 300 meters in a vineyard that is farmed by Francisca Wickens. The vineyard is a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to the age of the vines. The oldest vines were planted back in 1994, and the youngest vines were planted in about 2008. The soils are those classic Paardeberg decomposed granite soils, and all of the vines are farmed according to an organic farming method. This organic farming method is an absolute non-negotiable for a winemaker like Johan Meyer, because he's adopted a fairly stringent definition of what it means to produce a natural wine. Organic vineyards are part of that framework. So what does this natural wine taste like in the glass? Well, when we give it a sniff, well, we get a sort of piquant touch of volatile acidity, which in combination with exposure to oxygen in wine gives you a really interesting note of apple cider. Now, in conventional winemaking, you would have killed off the acetobacter that produces this note with a bit of sulfur. But when you're making wine naturally, you cannot add any sulfur, and so you don't have that option. And the volatile acidity levels usually climb a little bit higher. So alongside those apple cider notes, you might also get a hint of kombucha, especially when there are longer fermentations that are exposed to oxygen. Now we know from looking at the technical specs that 30% of this wine was fermented on the skin, so there was no doubt a little bit of oxygen going on in the winemaking. And when we look further at the technical analysis, we see that the VA on this wine is 1.0. Now the legal limit for VA in a wine is 1.2, so it's really quite high up. And yet, it totally works in this wine because alongside the kind of slightly weirder kombucha and apple cider, you then have far fresher notes of nectarine and apricot and peach and even a bit of floral osmanthus. And this is because the other 70% of the wine is fermented in stainless steel tanks, kept protected from oxygen. And the lack of oxygen protects those lovely fresher fruit and floral notes. Then we can add into all this that there's also a kind of stony, chalky gravel dust thing, which, I don't know, I guess kind of makes me feel fancy. Now, when we take a sip, well, again on the palate, you get that same really interesting contrast between apple cider on one hand and then fresher, cleaner apricot and peach notes. But for all the unusual contrast, on the finish, there's that super classic Chenin Blanc snap of bitter citrus that kind of closes everything out. Perhaps one more thing on the finish that reminds you that you're dealing with a slightly unusual wine is that there is a almost sort of floral, meaty spice note, if that makes any sense. It's kind of like what you get when you are over enthusiastic in the sniffing of a jasmine blossom. When you get really in close, you get a slightly deeper, meatier, spicy note that you would perhaps miss if you were just walking through a jasmine garden. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon and subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos every single month talking about things like unusual cultivars, unusual winemaking techniques, wine history, and some of the rising dynamic stars coming out of the South African winelands.